So there's an old saying about those who forget history. I don't remember it, but it's good. So I will start by introducing Sarah Bush, our next speaker. Sarah Bush is an assistant professor at Temple University, just down the road, and she's a fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. I guess you're officially a senior fellow. I remember when they used to call me a senior fellow when I was 40 years old, and I thought how cute that was. Not so cute anymore. I'm a senior fellow now. But anyway, Dr. Sarah Bush focuses primarily on democracy promotion, non-state actors in world politics, and gender and human rights policy in the developing world. Her first book, The Taming of Democracy Assistance, was published this past April. Other work has been published or is forthcoming in International Organization and International Studies Quarterly. She has fellowships at Harvard's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs and the Miller Center for Public Affairs at the University of Virginia. She got her bachelor's degree from Northwestern and her doctorate from Princeton University. With great pleasure, I introduce Sarah Bush.
Thank you. Okay, I'm just going to turn on my timer here so that I don't go too long. So thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to speak to you all today. I am delighted to be here. I was thinking about my presentation today a couple of days ago because I was coming back from Abu Dhabi, where I had gone in the United Arab Emirates for some work, and I was riding back in one of those AirTran sort of pods, with a couple of other people, and people were talking about, where were we all traveling from, and somebody asked me, where were you traveling from, and I said, I'm coming home from Abu Dhabi for work, and person asked me, the first question someone asked me after that is a question that I have often received when I have been coming back or going to the Middle East for my research, and the question was, what was that like as a woman? And so I thought, well, how appropriate that I'm going to be talking in a couple of days to all of you about the topic of women in politics in the Middle East. I think it's a topic that's been on a lot of people's minds in the last 10 or 15 years. I hope that over the course of their presentation today, I can help don't know what that was, help illuminate the topic, maybe answer some questions, raise some other ones, so I'm looking forward to it. So just to help set the stage here, I brought with me some data, some figures here with information about the relative status of women in the Middle East versus women in some other regions of the world. And I'll try to explain what this odd-looking figure here means. So this uses data from the World Bank, okay, and it shows in the red line how women are doing in what is sometimes called the MENA region. So that stands for Middle East and North Africa, okay? And it compares the women in the MENA region and the red line, and if you can't see it, if you're too far back, I'll just try to talk it out in words. It compares women in the MENA region to women in other developing regions. That's the black line. And it compares how women are doing in different regions of the world on various factors, okay? And one thing that we find, according to the data from the World Bank, is if you look at female life expectancy at birth in the Middle East and North Africa and compare it to female life expectancy at birth in other regions of the world with developing countries, it's the same, okay? It's about the same. And if you look at the ratio of girls to boys in primary and secondary education, and you compare that in the Middle East and North Africa to the rates in other world regions with developing countries, again, it's about the same. And if we look at some other socioeconomic indicators that we often think are sort of correlated with women's status in society, like how economically developed a country is, or how many children women tend to have, 2 or 12, that's the fertility rate. We see also here that countries in the Middle East are about the same as countries in other regions of the world that are considered by the World Bank to be developing countries. Okay, so even though we hear a lot about the poor status of women in the Middle East and North Africa, on a lot of indicators they're actually doing all right. But then there's two types of indicators where women in the Middle East and North Africa are doing worse than women in other developing countries around the world. And that has to do with women's involvement in political life, and then also women's involvement in the labor force. Okay, so if you look at the seats held by women in parliament, women in the Middle East have a much smaller proportion than women in other regions of the world. And if you look at the ratio of women to men in non-agricultural employment, same thing, okay? Just to show you these kinds of trends in a different way, here we have male and female labor force participation by region, okay? And the Middle East and North Africa region is here, so you can see female participation in the darker color and male participation in the lighter color. And then we have here Latin America, South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, Europe and Central Asia, and East Asia and the Pacific. Well, in every region of the world, the labor force participation is higher for men than it is for women, but you can see that the difference between these two bars is a lot starker for the Middle East and North Africa than for the other regions. Here I have this other key indicator that I mentioned, that women are different, women's empowerment is different in the Middle East which is political participation. Here again we have proportion of women in parliament by region. This is the Middle East and North Africa here. The blue bars represent the proportion of women in parliament in 90. Then the red bars represent the proportion of women in parliament in 2000, and then the green in 2010. And so you can see that in the Middle East and North Africa, we had this increase, which is the same actually for every world region. We have growing numbers of women in parliament. Nevertheless, despite the increase, it is a lot lower in this green bar in 2010, which is the most recent data here, than it is in the other world regions. And so this kind of trend, and also how it relates to the trend on the previous slide about labor force participation, that's kind of what I want to talk to you about today. That's going to be the heart of the presentation. So the presentation is going to have 3 sections, and the first section is going to be focused on the why question. So how did this happen? What are the most persuasive causes that we know about today for why women are underrepresented in politics in the Middle East? Then once we have a better understanding of the question of the causes of this phenomenon, then we're going to talk about the consequences of it. Why does it matter? What are the effects? And then finally, what are the solutions? Are there any solutions? What can be done to try to increase women's political participation in the Middle East? What are countries trying? What's working? What's not? So starting then with the first question of why this trend exists, the causes of underrepresentation. Since I don't want to take up all day with my presentation, I'm going to focus on 2 causes today. These are 2 causes that people like me who study political science think that are some of the most important ones, but there are other causes too. So my presentation will focus on a first potential cause of this trend, which is culture and or religion. These are often intertwined. I'm going to talk about a second potential explanation, which is oil. And then I'm just going to kind of make a note here. There are other potential possibilities. It could be something to do with the historical legacies of colonialism in the region versus in other regions. Perhaps it has something to do with geography, especially since countries often are like their neighbors. Maybe there's other things you're thinking of right now that aren't on my list. We could probably come up with a lot of ideas, but I'll focus on culture and religion because I think these are 2 of the main things that people who study this focus on. So starting with culture/religion. So I think the main proponents of the idea that women's underrepresentation in politics in the Middle East has something to do with culture or religion. There are two scholars, professors, Ronald Inglehart and Pippa Norris from the universities of Michigan and Harvard, that have gathered a lot of data to try to support this point of view. And you can kind of see the sort of data that they look at here in my slide. So they've surveyed dozens of countries around the world and asked people in these different countries about their attitudes on a host of different issues, okay? And they find, if you divide countries up into Western countries and Islamic heritage countries, that there's actually a lot of agreement on certain types of political and social values. So if you look here, you can see that in terms of the proportion of people that think that democratic ideals are important, that have a similar idea of what democratic performance for a government means, it's very similar here. But then there's a pretty big gap in terms of people's support for gender equality as they measure it using their survey questions, support for legal divorce, support for legal abortion, support for making homosexuality legal. And they sort of refer to this gap as the true clash of civilizations. Probably you've heard this phrase, clash of civilizations, a lot already, maybe, and during this conference, and maybe also criticized. But according to Inglehart and Norris, this is the true clash of civilizations, this difference between Western and Islamic countries when it comes to how people think about gender, how people think about sex, and different legal issues related to that. I'm not sure how well you can see this again, but here I have some other data from their studies that is looking at support for sexual liberalization, gender equality, religiosity, democratic values. And basically the takeaway from this slide is that they're comparing people in Islamic countries, people who are Muslim in Western countries, and then people who are Christian in Western countries. And they find that there is a gap between support for these different issues and your religious heritage, and then especially if you're in a country that has Islamic religious heritage, that's sort of the biggest gap there in support for these values. So they sort of look at all of this and they conclude culture or religion, that's really explaining the underrepresentation of women in the Middle East, those graphs that I started out the presentation with. So yeah, Islam, according to them, is a powerful barrier to gender equality because it's tied, they say, to patriarchal attitudes. So this is their argument. But the second argument that I want to present to you today takes into consideration another factor, which is oil. We know that many countries in the Middle East and North Africa share more than cultural and religious traditions, share more than colonial legacies, but many of them, not all of them, but many of them also are rich in oil. And some research suggests that this factor can also explain the unusually poor status of women in that region and can also explain variations in the status of women globally. So maybe you've heard about this idea of an oil curse. Yes, no, yeah. So this is the idea, for those that are nodding heads, for those that are not nodding heads, just to sketch it out, the idea that countries that we think, oh, they're lucky, they were endowed with natural resources, good for them, they can be rich. No, the people say, actually, these natural resources can be a curse. Often countries that have natural resource wealth are less democratic than other countries on average. They're less well governed. They can also be prone to have civil unrest. And this may relate to, people think, the way that having natural resources shapes a country's economy and therefore shapes its politics. So often countries that are rich in natural resources don't have to tax their citizens as much. And we know, from our country's own heritage that, when people start getting taxed, they expect things right in return. And so this can actually cause governments to be more representative, accountable. So that's one type of curse that can result from oil. But people have argued that there are other curses too that have a similar kind of causal logic, and one of them relates to the status of women. Okay, so the argument goes that oil can lead to these bad governance outcomes and lack of democracy, as well as subordination of women. And here's the idea. So oil production reduces the number of women in the labor force. That's the first step here. And when women participate less in the labor force, they also have reduced political influence, okay? And as a result of this, we may have these smaller amounts of women in parliaments, and we may also have stronger patriarchal values, okay? So according to them, the patterns that I showed you before of these different attitudes towards gender equality and related issues, they can be not the cause of women's underrepresentation, but sort of a result of it instead. The person who has developed this idea is a professor named Michael Ross. He is at UCLA. And the research that I'm going to be talking about was published a few years back in a journal called the American Political Science Review. I'm going to try to show a few trends here that illustrate the logic, okay? So if we look, this is a graph that with, on the x-axis, the oil and gas rents per capita over most of the 90s, basically, in countries. And then the y-axis is the proportion of women that make up the non-agricultural labor force, okay? And then these are basically, all of the dots represent Islamic countries, Islamic heritage countries, okay? And you can see here that when countries are close to zero here, they don't have oil or gas, they're not cursed with oil, we have a pretty, high proportion of women in the labor force, at least relative to other countries in this region, okay? But then as this oil and gas amounts increase, we stay really low down here in terms of the proportion of the labor force that is made up of women, okay? And the countries that you see down here that are named include Qatar, Kuwait, United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Bahrain, some of the countries that we often hear about as doing really poorly when it comes to gender equality. This, again, this graph shows the oil wealth of a country, and on the x-axis, and on the y-axis we have the year that women were granted suffrage in a country, okay? So starting down here in 1940 and then going up to 2000 for countries that have done it very, very recently, okay? So you can see, again, for the countries that have basically no or very, very little oil wealth, we have them clustered down here in the bottom, okay? Those are countries that, relative to others in the region, granted women the right to vote pretty early, okay? But then as we get more oil and gas, again, we get really up here in the recent years of female suffrage. And we have Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Kuwait, again, some of these familiar suspects. Another figure, again, x-axis, oil and gas per capita. And then here we're looking at something that is a gender rights scale. This is something where countries in the world have been coded by scholars Signorelli and Richards, and they're given a score. The higher the score, the more gender rights, okay? Not very much oil wealth. Well, here the countries are doing pretty well in terms of the gender rights. Oil and gas rents per capita get bigger, doing worse, okay? And then here, yeah, that's my final one, okay? But I could probably show you a few more graphs with different y-axes, and the pattern would stay the same here. Let me give you a comparison with a few specific countries to try to illustrate the mechanism here. So I'm talking about Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia. Algeria is the country out of these three that has oil wealth, okay? You can see here. Per capita, $937 of oil wealth per person, and then 0 in Morocco and only 61 in Tunisia, okay? Now, this maps on very well both to what the country's labor force looks like in terms of women's political participation, and then what the political life looks like in terms of women's participation, okay? So in Algeria, we have only 12% of the labor force female compared to 34% in Morocco. The data wasn't available for that year in Tunisia. And then in parliament, 6% in Algeria, 11 in Morocco, 23 in Tunisia. So it really, there does seem to be a correlation here. And something else I would note that you might find interesting has to do with these textile exports per capita. Well, textile industry in the developing world, this is often an industry that women are really active in, okay? And whereas basically Algeria doesn't have much of a textile industry, so just $0.09, 9 cents per capita in textile exports. In Tunisia, it's $287 per person in terms of textile exports. So basically the idea here is because Tunisia and Morocco, they were not blessed or cursed, depending on how you want to look at it, by oil. They have developed a different type of economy that depends more on things like exporting textiles instead of exporting oil. That causes women to participate more in the labor force, participate more in politics too as a result. And in general, Tunisia is one of the countries in the Arab world that does really well in terms of women's rights. Morocco does all right too, in comparison to someplace like Algeria. I'd like to make one more point actually about this, which is I think that the Algeria and Morocco comparison is particularly interesting because if you look at the income per capita of the two countries, you'll see that Algeria is a good deal wealthier than Morocco. So Algeria has about this sort of $600 to $700 difference in income per capita. So you might think, okay, Algeria, it's more developed, it's richer, that's usually the kind of country that has more gender equality. But in fact, it's the case that Morocco is doing better than Algeria. And I think it is very plausible to think that it has something to do with the makeup of the country's economies and the consequences of that. I'd like to just spend one more minute on Tunisia because it happens to be a favorite country of mine. The data that I presented on this previous slide comes before the revolution that took place in Tunisia in 2011. You can see here in the slide some women who were activists and celebrating around the country's revolution. Now, many people feared that when Tunisia transitioned to democracy, that this would become bad for women, okay? The country, during its authoritarian period, as I have shown you, had relative equality towards women. The long-ruling dictator was a big proponent of secularism, a big proponent of women's rights, and people worried, would democracy undermine all of these gains for women that had been in place before? I did some research there last fall with a collaborator that tried to look at one way, looked at this question in one way. What we did was we tried to understand whether, after Tunisia has now held its first democratic elections, it has its first free parliament. Now, we looked, and the parliament has very high proportion of women, compared to many countries in the world, including our own. We wanted to see how engaged are people going to be with these women representatives, because some people were worried that with the rise of political Islam in Tunisia, that women wouldn't be faring so well, or there wouldn't be as much engagement. So we had a survey that we conducted in Tunisia, and we had a little kind of experiment in the study. So what we did was we asked people, what do you think the main issue facing the country is? Overwhelmingly, people said it was the economy, okay, which I think is no big surprise. If you were following Tunisia, you know that economic stagnation was a big part of why people revolted, and it continues to be a key issue for the country, and I think key to whether the democratic transition continues to go forward peacefully and democratically. So people really focused on economics. Second issue was terrorism, but it was a distant second. After we asked people what they thought the main issue facing Tunisia was, we asked them, as part of efforts to educate new women, or we would say either women or women and men in parliament, about the issues their constituents are facing, we will send information to female or female and male representatives from your district if you give us permission? Do you want us to tell your female or your female and male representatives your answer about the main problem facing the country? And basically, we rolled a dice during the study to determine if people were asked about the women or the women and men, okay? And because the dice is just random, right, you should get, your chance of being even is the same as your chance of being odd. The people who were asked about the women should be more or less identical to the people that were asked about the women and men. And so we can do a really good comparison to see if people are more willing to contact female representatives or more willing to contact male and female representatives. One thing that we were really kind of surprised to find out is people were actually more willing to contact the female representatives than the mixed representatives. So, people were willing to communicate in both cases, okay? So, 82% wanted to contact the female representatives, 84% for the male, or the mixed, I should say. But it's a significant difference, and we thought that was pretty interesting. Just if you're interested, this kind of design, this research that we did, asking the question about the main issue and then would you like to communicate this, people asked a similar two questions in the United States. People ask these questions in surveys. And with Congress being so unpopular, it's like less than half of Americans will communicate their preferences to Tunisians, or Tunisians are pretty excited, still hopeful about their new parliament, the first, democratically elected one that they've got. So everyone's enthusiastic about communicating, but people are more willing to communicate with the women than the women and the men. And interestingly, this holds for both men and women. Okay, if we compare the two groups of respondents in our survey. So I have some explanations for why I think people are more willing to contact the women than the women and the men, and I would be happy to talk about that if you're interested, but I'll just leave it kind of at that for now. But to say that I think this is a pretty hopeful finding with regards to the future of Tunisia. It's a country where people were where we had a pretty high level of gender equality before the revolution, and I think that signs are still looking hopeful for the country now. That's one of the takeaways that I have from that research. So I think with that, let me move on to my sort of second topic, which is the topic of the consequences. So we've talked about the causes, now let's talk about the consequences. So in case you're wondering, why do we have a presentation on this topic? Does it matter? Let me offer a couple of ideas about why it might matter. Well, so one reason it might matter is because you might think that the underrepresentation of women is just a bad thing, that it is important to have representative bodies that represent their people, that's important in a sort of descriptive sense. From a more sort of pragmatic stance, not just about the issue of right and wrong, a reason why underrepresentation of women matters is because research suggests that when there are more women in a representative body, that the policies that the body adopts are different, okay? So we kind of have different laws being written, different implementation, and I'll give you a couple of examples of that in a minute. And then finally, and this is the one that's really important for, I think, the Middle East, or people have argued it really matters, is that people think that the underrepresentation of women in the Middle East may be not just related, sort of related in this oil curse sense to democratization, but it might also kind of perpetuate authoritarianism in the region. So I'll talk about that in a little bit more depth. Let me talk just a couple of examples of the policy outcomes. So countries in the Middle East have been adopting more and more equal laws with regards to gender issues. And some people think that might be related to that earlier slide I showed you that suggested that the proportion of women in parliament is sort of creeping up there and it's creeping up in other parts of the world. I don't know if you followed this, but this is an example of sort of focus on women and how it relates to women in representation from the U.S. that I've always thought was really striking. So for a long time, the National Institute of Health, when it funded studies in the States, there was no requirement to have both men and women as subjects in the studies. And so because it was sort of easier for scientists for various reasons to just focus on men in studies, and you have like a nice controlled comparison, right, which is always good when I have my like social scientist hat on. And nobody was saying you need to change this, so until it became an issue in Congress, and it was something that was really relatively bipartisan, and it was taken up by women in Congress. And that's an example of something where maybe the presence of a certain group, whether it's women or a group, an ethnic group or whatever group, when they're there, they can have an effect on the policies that are being made. Research also suggests that women may be more likely to pursue a sort of consensus-oriented or cooperative leadership style. There's some research that also looks across countries and finds that when countries have more women in their parliaments, they're more likely to pass laws with bipartisan support, so maybe that's a reason. Finally, a reason sort of in terms of policy outcomes is that research suggests that women who are just like everyday citizens become more engaged in the political process when they see women that are involved in positions of political leadership. So that can affect policy outcomes because we have different people voting, and we have different people calling representatives and so on. Let me talk about democratization, though. So, as you know, it comes to no surprise, I'm sure, to anyone in this room that Middle East is the region in the world that has been consistently for a long time least democratic. So here I'm showing you some data from the Freedom House, which is a nonprofit organization based in Washington, D.C. that rates countries in terms of their political liberty and their civil liberty every year. Okay, so it is a really good benchmark to use to track democratic change over time. And you can see basically that Middle East, if we look at how it scored in terms of political liberty in 1989, it was down at the bottom with Africa. Okay, it was 2.15, Africa was 2.09. But if we look in 2010, Africa has become almost a 4 on the scale, which is on 7 points. Middle East is still down there, around 2, okay? And then kind of a similar pattern if we look at civil liberties. So Middle East has been authoritarian, continues to be authoritarian, and the continues to be authoritarian part is especially noteworthy because so many countries in the last 25 years have become more democratic, whether in sub-Saharan Africa or Eastern Europe or Asia. So what's going on? So some people think that it has something to do with the subordination of women. So here's how the story goes. So after controlling, if we look across countries, after you control for a lot of things that you think would be related to how democratic countries are, how developed they are economically, what their religious traditions are, what region they're in, and more, okay? We find that societies that subordinate women are less likely to be democratic using this kind of Freedom House measure that I talked about. Scholar at University of California, Berkeley is associated with this idea. He looks at different indicators of women's status, some of the kinds of indicators that I've been talking about already with you today. One is looking at literacy rates, difference between men and women. One is looking at the number of men born per 100 females. Another one is looking at this proportion of women in high-ranking political positions. He thinks that a general culture of domination, of which gender equality is one element but not the only element, that this promotes sort of authoritarian ideas and a culture of authoritarianism. He also has made the argument that when we have gender inequality and separation between men and women, that this can spawn sort of violent attitudes and poor integration. Okay, so I'm going to stop there, just in the interest of time. I want to spend the last bit of my talk talking about some solutions that have been proposed. So I've tried to sketch the case that the underrepresentation of women in the Middle East is important, that it has consequences that we should care about. I've tried to make the case that it has some kind of very deep roots, maybe having to do with the structure of the economy or oil. It's not going to be easy to change those things, right? If you think it has something to do with culture, it's not going to be easy to change that either. So what do? Do we throw up our hands and give up and just feel sorry for people, women that are being underrepresented? Well, some people talk about solutions. So let's consider what some of them are. So one idea is to try to advance economic development in countries. This, I think, the idea is that as countries become more developed, more women will feel able to go into the workforce. Fertility rates often drop. This is often associated with gender equality, people suggest. So this is kind of a modernization idea. You may have heard people use that phrase before. This is an indirect way to advance women in politics and women in economic life, but it might be a good way to do it. Thinking about this oil hypothesis that I talked about before, you notice that textile and garment industries are often ones that really allow women to play a big role. And so perhaps if you want to encourage women's economic chances, if you want to encourage their political chances, maybe you should encourage those industries. I think there's a logic to that. You might also think that you would want to advance women's participation through education. This hopefully would widen economic opportunities and also political ones, stimulate political interest. A fourth idea would be to pursue the adoption and then implementation of international laws that support gender equality. So, for example, there's something called the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. That is abbreviated as CEDAW. So this is kind of the big international treaty that is about gender equality. Almost all countries in the world have actually adopted this. They've signed it and ratified it. But the devil is in the details when it comes to the implementation and whether or not countries actually live up to the promises they make when they sign and ratify this. So we could encourage, if you're somebody who wants to support women in the developing world, in the Middle East in particular, there are NGOs in every country that has signed CEDAW that are trying to, yell at their governments until they meet the obligations that they've signed up to, right? So that would be a strategy. A final strategy would be to encourage the adoption of something that is known as gender quotas. I'll talk about this one in some detail because it's a particular solution that is of interest to me. So it's one I know some of the most about. So I'll tell you about that. And it's not actually, don't talk about it just because I know about it, but also because it is, like CEDAW, a solution that is being pursued by a lot of countries in the world. So this is something that's very active right now. So this is a world map that basically any country that is not gray on the map, so if you're dark green, light green, middle color green, that country has adopted some form of what is known as a gender quota, okay? Gender quotas are laws that countries pass that promise to set aside a certain number of seats for women in parliament. That's one way that a gender quota can work. Another way that a gender quota can work is sometimes if parties are nominating lists of candidates, the quota will say you need to have every other candidate be a woman. So there's different ways to go about implementing it, but the end goal is always supposed to be increasing the number of women in parliament. And more than 100 countries have adopted these quotas, actually. And most countries in the Middle East have done so. And that is a big reason why, if you think back to the earlier slide I showed you that showed that how, if you look at 1990 versus 2000 versus 2010, we have a lot more women in parliament in 2010 than in 2000 and then versus 1990. That's because across the developing world, countries have adopted these laws, okay? So they're very common. And they're very controversial as well, okay, as you would expect any major institutional reform that's being adopted by countries everywhere would be. So what's good? Well, They generally increase the number of women in parliaments and other legislative bodies. So if you think that that's a good thing, whether for just it's the right thing to do or pragmatically for some of the reasons I discussed, then you would think this is a good thing. They tend to also have these sort of knock-on effects of getting more people engaged in the political process. That's what's known as symbolic, sort of a symbolic effect of the representation of women. What's bad about them? Well, one is that they don't always enjoy widespread political support. So adopting quotas is something that countries have been encouraged to do in the developing world, often under a lot of encouragement or pressure, you might say, from the international community. Maybe the United States and other countries will go to a country like Jordan, which doesn't score that well historically when it comes to women's rights, and say, listen, you want to qualify for foreign aid, you need to do something about this. Okay, so if an undemocratic country is adopting a measure like this, it might be more for an eye towards the international reputation than for a response to local pressure. So that could be bad. Maybe it won't have legitimacy. Finally, a concern is that there's a number of more advantages and disadvantages than what I have time to list here, but I think another big disadvantage that is often talked about is maybe the people that are elected via quotas are not actually going to be effective representatives. And I think that the debate about quotas is kind of like the debate that surrounds any kind of affirmative action policy. Does it help people who need help? Does it, is it fair? Is it, do the people who get elected in the case of quotas, are they sufficiently well educated? Are they just the relative of a male politician who wants to try to increase his power by getting his sister elected, something like that? So there's a lot of pros and cons. I happen to be interested, I think, in especially this first question of what happens when countries adopt quotas without a lot of popular support and with encouragement from the international community. I think for those of us sitting here who care about this issue, I think this is one of the things that's pertinent for us, is this a good thing that the international community promote? We know that the United States, other actors often from the international community are often suspected a lot in the Middle East, may not have a lot of local legitimacy for a lot of different reasons. I don't know if people had the chance to read it or not, but I recommended a short piece from Time by anthropologist Leila Abu-Lughod, who asked this question, do Muslim women really need saving? And she notes that there has been a lot of effort on the part of the international community to, sort of say, like, oh no, Muslim women have a problem, like, let's go help them. And, maybe people who are trying to do the help don't always know what they're doing or have an effective way of going about it. So, there are these reasons to think it might be bad. So, I was looking at this question in the case of Jordan, which, as I was alluding to before, is a country that has adopted one of these quota laws and did it with a lot of international encouragement, because Jordan, as you may know, is really dependent on the United States for foreign aid, which is very important for the government's survival. And the United States is interested in countries like Jordan doing at least some things to democratize, maybe not democratizing all the way, but at least doing a little bit there. And women's rights is has been a major avenue for this kind of encouragement from the U.S. government. So kind of following a similar sort of, this is a picture of a woman voting in Jordan, following a similar kind of research design to the one that I mentioned in Tunisia. I conducted with a collaborator survey in Jordan a couple of years ago, where basically we, again, divided people into two groups and asked them two different questions. Okay, so in one case, we told them that the U.S. government a U.S. government-sponsored organization had really been encouraging the quota in Jordan. and then asked them a series of questions about whether or not they supported women's rights. And then in the other group, we said, actually, religious leaders have supported a quota here and women's participation in politics. How much do you support women's rights? So basically, each person gets a sort of endorsement. One is religious, one is American. We want to see, do people change in terms of their support for women's political participation depending on who they hear endorses it. We thought going into it that when people heard, because Jordan is a country where there is a high level of anti-Americanism, we thought that people might react pretty negatively to hearing the U.S. endorsement, and we thought that maybe people would respond better to the religious endorsement. We were wrong. And in fact, people were just as happy with women's rights in either case. There was really no big effect of hearing about the U.S. endorsement, and it wasn't worse than the religious endorsement. So, I mean, we took away from that sort of an idea that although trying to support women's political participation, if you're the United States and you're trying to do it in a country like Jordan, of course it still is an endeavor that is very challenging. At least it's not going to, you're not just going to have a backlash against women's equality or women's rights just because you're on the side of this issue. And given that the United States can encourage the adoption of quotas in a country like Jordan, maybe it's somehow even a net win. So let me just conclude then. So I think some of just to hit again some of the main things that I wanted to hit in the presentation. So I think the first main point I wanted to be sure to make kind of returns to this figure, and more importantly, the idea that on some indicators, women in the Middle East are actually doing pretty well, or at least as well as women are doing in the rest of the world. It's really in the political sphere and in terms of labor participation where they fall behind. I said that I wanted to go through the 3 questions during the talk. We talked about both culture or religion and oil as possible explanations for this poor standing of women in political and economic life in the Middle East. We talked about some of the consequences of this phenomenon, especially highlighting the importance of it for democracy. We talked about some solutions, especially quotas. I think I have 3 takeaways. Apparently that's what people are doing. I hope there are 3. We'll see what happens when I press this button. So I think first takeaway, again, like I said, women actually do okay on some measures of equality in the Middle East, but not others. It's political life and labor force where they don't do so well. This matters. That's the second point. And then the third point is institutional reforms like quotas, they're not a panacea. They can't fix everything. They have problems, okay? But they can help counteract structures, whether it is the economic structure of a society or the social structure that lead to women's exclusion. And I think given some of the consequences of underrepresentation, that's a good thing. So with that, I will leave it, and thank you, and look forward to your questions. See a few questions over here. Yeah.
Yeah, we take a microphone.
Do I? Oh, okay. I see. Great.
Dr. Bush, thank you very much for what maybe for the first time this weekend seems to be an optimistic presentation, and that's kind of my question, or would like to hear about. I was talking to a participant in the after dinner last night, and the conversation had gotten sort of gloomy again. And as a educator and wanting to go back and talk to my students or present them with information, it can get gosh awfully depressing to talk about a lot of these things with my students. But this seems to be something that perhaps is a hopeful sign, you know, the rates of female participation going up. And I guess, would you see that perhaps as a potential way to frame something to high school teenagers who I think if you leave them with, they need a little something to walk away with going, oh, okay, it's not all, gloom and doom. I just wanted you to maybe reflect on that a little bit from your opinion.
Yeah, thank you. So, yeah, I totally agree with you that it can be so depressing studying and talking about the Middle East. It's not, and people always say, if you study politics more generally, even not the Middle East, like you don't do it because it's pretty, right? Because it's rarely is it pretty. It's usually ugly, but we do it because we care about it. So I do think that it would probably be possible for me to have presented this in a more negative way, but I think that it's right to take a relatively optimistic point of view. And I think that you're right that maybe this could be a good glimmer of hope to go back to the students with, although I would defer to all of you about, you know how to do that better than I do. But I do think there's a glimmer of hope here, because I think that although women and men's lives in countries like Syria are obviously very, very difficult right now, I think if we look at the region as a whole, we do see some positive movement on these issues. And I think through institutions like Quotas that I talked about, which are certainly flawed and have all sorts of tricks to their implementation that can make them work better or worse. I think they're offering a way for states to kind of, leapfrog ahead or really skip a few stages of development and really get more women in parliament. And that doesn't change everything, but it matters. And I think that, it's interesting to me thinking about our own country in an election season right now. We see, these are also issues about, who's going to be represented, whose voices can be on the stage, at the table, in government. To me, that seems like something that is also very relevant to us as Americans, and, people who are thinking about our country's future. So I think, there's a way in which some of these issues are like all of our issues, although, of course, how they get raised, depending on what country you live in, the way in which they get raised is very different. And for some it's can be life or death, right? And for others it's a different kind of effect. But I do think that there is some cause for optimism with these trends. It's are things getting better fast enough? No, no. Do they still have a long way to go? Yes. Are they better than they used to be? When I started even studying this topic, maybe 7 years ago, yeah. So that's good. So I think it can be optimistic. So I'm glad to provide at 8:30 on Sunday morning a little bit of good news, I guess.
So thank you again, that was great. I have a question about another potential solution that actually one of my students did an independent study on. She was looking at the impact of what she called celebrity worship, and I wonder about individual players like Queen Rania in Jordan or the Saudi prince this summer who donated his fortune to issues including women's issues, Christoph, who will take American celebrities. Have you had a chance to look at, do they have the level of impact that, say, Quotas might, or seeing more female participation in the political system might?
Yeah, that's so interesting. So I can only sort of speak in an impressionistic sense. It's not something that I've looked at in depth. But I think that you're right that these kinds of role models and examples can have a big effect. And I think that it's also the case that they can shine a light on an issue and get people talking. So I think those are huge. The example, and then also the media attention, the ability to shape the discourse, those all seem to me to be very powerful roles that celebrities can play on this issue and other ones. I don't know, if it's the issue something like landmines and Princess Diana, right? I mean, you can really see how sometimes celebrities have an important role to play. So I think that that's right. I was really interested, and I'm sorry to say that her name escapes me right now, but I was interested when I was in Abu Dhabi. I mentioned, like 5 days ago, I was talking to someone there who is mentioning a woman who is, I believe, I believe she's a corporal. I'm not sure just what her rank is, but she is basically in the Air Force in the UAE and has been kind of a celebrity. She was participating in some of the air campaign that the government was pursuing in Yemen. And, you know, like, that's an incredible, this is a young woman who's doing this. You know, the picture, she's like, you know, sitting in a cockpit, and I think these kinds of examples can have a really big effect. So it's I'd love to read your students' independent study.
So I was wondering about the oil thesis you were talking about. If it's really to hold up, wouldn't I have to compare it also to Venezuela, Nigeria, Norway, Canada, United States, Russia? Doesn't seem like that variable affects participation or anything else when you take it out of the context of the Arab world. So maybe it's really other variables that explain.
Yeah, so actually the study that I mentioned that is done by Professor Michael Ross, I focused just because of the context of our talk on those graphs that included the Islamic heritage countries. But in his analysis, he looks at all countries over, I think, about a 40-year period. And he actually finds that holding these other variables constant, there is a trend across country. It's not just a Middle East trend, actually. And so, you know, I think that although it may not be the case that Venezuela, you know, Venezuela is not Saudi Arabia when it comes to women's rights, but Venezuela compared to what Venezuela would look like without oil, I think there's some reason to think actually that the shape of the country's economy might be different, and that this could have some political effects. But I think it's a great point, because you're right. It shouldn't just be in the Middle East. But in his analysis, he looks at other countries. He includes other countries, and he still finds this kind of correlation.
You said that Tunisia was a case that you were very interested in. Could you comment on the recent Nobel Peace Prize award and what that tells us about how Tunisia has been successful? Yeah,
I think it is a great moment for the country. So people who follow Tunisia, Tunisians as well, not just people who follow Tunisia from the outside, often feel either rightly or wrongly that international support and attention to the country's democratic transition has not been enough. That as the country that is really a bright spot after the Arab Spring, that remains a bright spot, that is the most promising country to remain peaceful and democratic out of all of the countries that had popular protests. I think people in the country, people who follow the country, really hope that it will have a lot of international support, and are sometimes disappointed that there isn't more. Although there is plenty. It's not like people have totally forgotten about Tunisia, but I think understandably our attention gets drawn to Egypt, to other countries in the region, and so I think that people who follow Tunisia, including myself, were excited by the Nobel Prize because I think it is a chance to refocus attention on the country and to remember what's going well there, and hopefully to encourage governments that have the ability to help the transition to do so. So I mentioned that the country's economy is crucial to its political future, and something I didn't say is that, as you know, the terrorist attacks that have happened there have really kept tourists away, which is a major source of the country's income. And this is just a huge problem. That's a reason why tourist sites are being chosen, I think, because this is really important for the country's future. And so I think with tourist income, back down, other forms of economic growth very stagnant, it's very important for countries to follow up, the promises of aid, the promises of other types of economic benefits, whether through trade agreements or through investment deals, to really match the kind of talk with action. Sometimes there was a lot of talk in 2011, and not all of the big aid promises were actually pursued, or countries like Jordan and Morocco ended up being able to benefit from foreign aid vehicles that were supposed to help Arab Spring countries, and of course Jordan and Morocco were not Arab Spring countries. They're still monarchies. So I'm hopeful that this is a chance to focus on Tunisia again, that it's in the news, that it's on people's minds, and I think that's kind of, it was taken as a big validation, but also as like a, okay, now what, kind of for the country.
Can you speak to the effectiveness of things like microloans for women in a lot of these countries, or do you have to have the parliamentary support before they're even allowed to get microloans and start their own businesses, or could that be an effective prong in the fight for gender equality?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know a lot about microlending. I know there have been debates about its effectiveness. I don't follow them as closely as I wish that I would. I mean, I think so. I just kind of answer the question in a somewhat abstracted way, which is to say that I think that it's very. I think what you're saying is exactly right. That given that we know that gender equality is intimately related to women's economic prospects, that anything that effectively helps women's economic prospects, we would expect to also have knock-on effects in terms of their political representation, their political participation, and so on. I think that I have the impression that microlending, it depends a lot on how it's done, just who it helps, and as with so many of the foreign aid programs, that the details are really important. So I think, in principle, it seems like something that should be very effective. I don't know enough about the details to speak about like the specifics of different initiatives, but I think the idea is right, because economic prospects are so important.
I was wondering if you could talk about, this was just generated from your presentation, why were Tunisians more likely to speak to women than male representatives in parliament? Thanks,
yeah. So I think we found, if you remember, we found about a 5% difference in terms of people's willingness to speak with the female representatives and then the mixed gender representatives. And if we broke it down between men and women, the same effect was there. But if we break it down by party of the respondent, we find very different effects. And in particular, if you are basically a supporter of the party that's called Nida Tunis, this is the party that won a plurality of seats in parliament. This is also the party that won the presidency. So this is the party that's in power. There's no difference among supporters of this party in their willingness to contact men and women. They're just the exact same. But if you look at supporters of any other of the many parties, many of which are Islamists, so you might think of them as being kind of conservative when it comes to gender issues, that's where we see the big difference. And we think, and we have some evidence in favor of this, but because it was so unexpected to us, we didn't ask all of the questions that I wish we had had. But we do have some evidence in favor of this, that really what's going on is that people think that women are cooperative leaders, that they're consensus-oriented leaders. And if you are somebody who is not in the political majority, that sounds good, right? Like if you're in the political majority, who needs cooperation? Who needs consensus? We've got it by ourselves. But if you're in one of the other parties, that sounds a lot better. And people that are not in the majority party, they think that women are more effective. Also, that's something that we found in our study, that they were more effective representatives than male representatives were. So I think that that's what's going on. I think it's kind of it's about stereotypes, but maybe kind of a positive or a way that a stereotype can have a positive effect, because at least for many people in Tunisia that are not supporters of the main party, cooperation sounds pretty good.
I have a two-part question. Number one, who is the Berkeley political scientist who advances this notion that there's a correlation between generally authoritarianism in the Middle East and patriarchal attitudes? Because I think that research is supported by global kind of, not just looking at the Middle East, but, for instance, in my class on women and politics, I teach about early suffrage dates, and it's kind of stunning what level of correlation exists between countries that granted women right to vote and general advance of democracy in the Western world. It's, for instance, less known fact is that Western states in the United States granted women right to vote way before, Eastern states, and then the Southeast was the dead last. And, that correlates with lots of things in terms of history of the United States. So I would like to know that research, and because it really fits nicely. But the second question I wanted to ask you is that given the clash, general authoritarianism in the Middle East and the clash between secularists and Islamists, it's way too often happens that authoritarian secularists attack Islamists on the issue of women's rights precisely, but they're authoritarian, right? So if, what you diagnosed and you generally supported that research in your presentation about authoritarianism and lack of women's rights, then Middle East is one of the regions in the world when authoritarianism is advanced in the name of women's rights under the heading of secularism. And then if the research is right, women's rights are attacked under the heading of women's rights. And I would like you to comment on that paradox that emerges from what you presented, and I think you endorse that research.
Yeah, so it is a total paradox, and I thank you for your comment. I think you expressed the ideas very nicely. I think that's part of the reason why I've been interested in looking at what happens in Tunisia, because that's a great case where under the authoritarian government, there was a very staunch support of secularism and very staunch support of gender equality. And I think people have been worried that when there's no longer an authoritarian government, that are women's rights going to be walked back? And what is the future of women's rights in Tunisia? That kind of very shortly after the revolution, you started seeing a lot of articles being written with that kind of question. I guess I'm not sure that the events, at least in Tunisia since the revolution, support such a pessimistic kind of view, because I think that although with the end of authoritarianism and the sort of shift from that era's secularist rule, things are different there now. So there are multiple Islamist political parties, and many people are wearing a headscarf, and so things look different, things are different. But I don't think none of people's worst fears about the Constitution walking back women's rights, they haven't been realized. Constitution remains progressive, and I think that whether you look at the kind of evidence from my survey or kind of other events that have been going on there, we still have really high proportion of women in parliament. We still have women's rights protected. We still have women, ordinary citizens participating. So I think things are still pretty good. But I think you're totally right that this is a dynamic that's going on. I mean, in Jordan, I think this is definitely the case, that the government seeks to promote its reputation as being very progressive, or at least more progressive than the populace when it comes to issues of gender, but it's authoritarian. So, but it's like a nice authoritarian, because it has this kind of equality. So it's very tricky. The person at Berkeley, his name is Stephen Fish.
Thank you. I'm wondering if in Tunisia, the women representative economic class has something to do with how they represent women issue, and whether or not they're focused more on upper or middle class women's rights as opposed to lower income, because that may be the problem in the future.
Yeah, that's a great question. The parliament is remains young in Tunisia, so I think we're still figuring out what it's going to do and who's going to represent what, and the laws that will be passed. So I think that it remains to be seen. But what I will say is that Tunisia is one of the countries that has a quota for women, but it's not a set of reserved seats. It is a law that requires parties to include a certain proportion of women in their candidates. And as a consequence, parties across the political spectrum have 25% women that have become elected. So it's not just the left party, it's not just the right party, it's not just the party that is more representing working class interests or the party that's more representing wealthier interests. Everybody's got women. So on that sense, they should be representing, I think, a spectrum of political views, a spectrum of economic interests. But at the same time, it remains to be seen. It'll be interesting to see what kind of coalitions continue to form, what kind of positions of leadership within the parliament women take on, and what kind of policies they advance. So we'll have to stay tuned.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.